of the Secret History of the Court of Justinian by Procopius. Those who were considered the wealthiest persons in Byzantium and other cities of the empire, next after the members of the Senate, were robbed of their wealth by Justinian and Theodora in the manner which I have described above. I shall now describe how they managed to take away all the property of the members of the Senate. There was at Constantinople one Zeno, grandson of that Anthemius, who formerly had been emperor of the West. They sent this man to Egypt as governor. He delayed his departure while he loaded his ship with precious valuables, for he had silver beyond any man's counting, and gold plate set with pearls and emeralds, and with other like precious stones. But Justinian and Theodora bribed some of those who passed for his most faithful servants to take everything out of the ship as fast as they could, set it on fire in the hold, and then go and tell Zeno that his ship had taken fire of its own accord, and that all his property was lost. Some time after this, Zeno died suddenly, and they took possession of his property as his heirs, producing a well which, it is currently reported, was never made by him. In like manner, they made themselves the heirs of Tatian, of Demosthenes, and of Hilera, persons who at the time held the first rank in the Roman Senate. They obtained other persons' fortunes by the production, not of formal wills, but of counterfeit conveyances. This was how they became the heirs of Dionysius, who dwelt in Labienus, and of John the son of Basil, who was the leading man in Edessa, and had been delivered up to the Persians and hostage against his will by Belisarius, as I have told already. Carausius kept this John a prisoner and refused to let him go, declaring that the Romans had not performed all the terms of the treaty for which John had been given in pledge by Belisarius, but he was prepared to let him be ransomed as a prisoner of war. His grandmother, who was still alive, got together the money for his ransom, not less than 2,000 pounds of silver, and would have ransomed her grandson. But when this money arrived at Dara, the emperor heard of the transaction and forbade it, that the wealth of Romans might not be conveyed to barbarians. Not long after this John fell ill and died, whereupon the governor of the city forged a letter which he said John had written to him as a friend not long before, to the effect that he desired the emperor to succeed to his property. I could not give the list of all other people whose heirs Justinian and Theodora became by the free will of the testators. However, up to the time of the insurrection called Nika, they only plundered rich men of their property one by one. But when this broke out, as I have described in my former works, they then sequestered nearly all of the property of the Senate. They laid their hands upon all the movables and the finest parts of the estates, but set apart such lands as were burdened with grievous imposts, and, under the pretense of kindness, restored them to their former possessors. So these people, oppressed by the tax-gatherers, and tormented by the never-ceasing interest to be paid upon their debts, became weary of their lives. For the reasons which I have stated, I, and many of my position, never believed that they were really two human beings, but evil demons, and what the poets call scourges of mankind, who laid their heads together to see how they could fastest and most easily destroy the race and the works of man, but who had assumed human forms and became something between men and demons, and thus convulsed the whole world. One can find proofs of this theory more particularly in the superhuman power with which they acted. There is a wide distinction between the human and the supernatural. Many men have been born, in every age, who, either by circumstances or their own character, have shown themselves terrible beings, who became the ruins of cities, countries, and whatever else fell into their hands. But to destroy all men, and to ruin the whole earth has been granted to none save these two, who have been helped by fortune and their schemes to destroy the whole human race. For about this time, much ruin was caused by earthquakes, pestilences, and inundations of rivers, as I shall immediately tell you. Thus it was not by mere human power, but by something greater, that they were enabled to work their evil will. It is said that Justinian's mother told some of her intimates that Justinian was not the son of Sabatius, her husband, or of any human being, but that, at the time when she became pregnant, an unseen demon accompanied with her, whom she only felt as when a man has connection with a woman, and who then vanished away as in a dream. Some who have been in Justinian's company, in the palace very late at night, men with a clear conscience, have thought that in his place they have beheld a strange and devilish form. One of them said that Justinian suddenly arose from his royal throne and walked about, although indeed he could never sit still for long, and that at that moment his head disappeared, while the rest of his body still seemed to move to and fro. The man who beheld this stood trembling and troubled in mind, not knowing how to believe his eyes. Afterwards, the head joined the body again, and united itself to the parts from which it had so strangely been severed. Another declared that he stood beside Justinian as he sat, and of a sudden his face turned into a shapeless mass of flesh, without either eyebrows or eyes in their proper places, or anything else which makes a man recognizable. But after a while he saw the form of his face come back again. What I write here I did not see myself, but I heard it told by men who were positive that they had seen it. They say too that a certain monk, highly in favor with God, was sent to Byzantium by those who dwelt with him in the desert, to beg that favor might be shown to their neighbors who had been wronged and outraged beyond endurance. When he arrived at Byzantium, he straightway obtained an audience of the emperor, but just as he was about to enter his apartment, he started back and turning round suddenly withdrew. The eunuch who was escorting him, and also the bystanders, besought him earnestly to go forward, but he made no answer, but like one who has had a stroke of the palsy, made his way back to his lodging. When those who had come with him asked why he acted thus, they say that he distinctly stated that he saw the chief of the devils sitting on his throne in the midst of the palace, and he would not meet him or ask anything of him. How can one believe this man to have been anything but an evil demon, who never took his fill of drink, food, or sleep, but snatched at the meals which were set before him anyhow, and roamed about the palace at untimely hours of the night, and yet was so passionately addicted to venery? Some of Theodora's lovers, when she was still on the stage, declared that a demon had fallen upon them, and driven them out of her bedchamber, that it might pass the night with her. There was a dancer named Macedonia, who belonged to the Blue faction of Antioch, and who had very great influence with Justinian. This woman used to write letters to him while Justin was still on the throne, and thus easily made away with any great man in the East whom she chose, and caused their property to be confiscated for the public use. They say that this Macedonia once greeted Theodora when she saw her very much troubled and cast down at the ill treatment which she had received at the hands of Hesebolius, and at the loss of her money on her journey, and encouraged and cheered her, bidding her remember the fickleness of fortune which might again grant her great possessions. They say that Theodora used to tell how, that night, she had a dream which bade her take no thought about money, for that when she came to Byzantium, she would share the bed of the chief of the demons, that she must manage by all means to become his wedded wife, and that afterwards she would have all the wealth of the world at her disposal. This was the common report in regard to these matters.
Restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness, and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, that, impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed farther westward, to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of the first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him smile or to speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land, which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage brought by the axe. Apparently, the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards, weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and, directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long, full beard were white, his gray, lusterless eyes sunken, his face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him. These particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that early day. One day Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told and should remember. I know only that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstance that many years afterwards, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghosts which every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter, that supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and a light heart. There is no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain the doubt, but God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life, for what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health, but at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness and so passed away, apparently, with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. Tomorrow, he said aloud, I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her, when she is no longer in sight. But now she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem. He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically, with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck, that knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low-grade chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all sensibilities to a keener life, to another as the blow of a bludgeon, which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge, and dropped his face into them, tearless yet unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the window a long, wailing sound, like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening woods. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast. Perhaps it was a dream. For Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke, and lifting his head from his arms intently listened, he knew not why. There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see he knew not what. His senses were all alert, his breath was suspended, his blood had stilled its ties as if to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light soft step, another, sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him, and at the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, with a little groping seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman toward the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there was darkness blacker than before, and silence, and when he returned to consciousness the sun was high and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear.
The Doppelganger by Howard Pease. So this was the old home, the cradle of his race. Percy Osbaldistone of Osbaldistone Tower gazed curiously about him in what had formerly been the library, and espied a capacious Queen Anne chair by the fireside, which looked inviting. Having ensconced himself therein, he put up his feet against the mantelpiece, lit a long cigar, and drew in the smoke slowly and meditatively. The old housekeeper and her pretty niece had given him a good supper, and he himself, foreseeing empty cellars, had brought with him an ample freight. So now at the long last he had arrived in harbor. After all his vicissitudes, and being for years the black sheep of the ancient family, that he should come into possession of Osbaldistone Tower and Manor touched his vein of humor. He laughed grimly, rubbed one hand upon the other, and looked contemptuously up at the portrait of an ancestor who seemed to be scowling at the last representative of his race. It was true that there was not much of the old family estate left, and what was left was mortgaged, but still it was good for a few thousands, and the family lawyer had to find them or go. The heir of the Osbaldistones continued his reflections. He didn't give a damn for his ancestors, for what had they done save bring him into the world, a doubtful blessing. Après moi le déluge, murmured he to himself with a cynical smile, as he ensconced himself deeper in the recesses of his armchair and drank deep from the glass by his side. His hand shook badly, and he spilled some drops of whiskey and soda upon his trousers. "Damn!" cried he in annoyance. Then to himself, sotto voce, "Now that I've got back to this old quiet place, I'll soon have my rotten nerves right again." Looking up after wiping his trousers, he suddenly perceived, to his great astonishment, for he had heard no sound of entrance, a fellow seated in the chair opposite, which nestled under the Spanish leather screen that kept off the draught from the door behind. "Who the devil are you?" inquired the lord of the manor angrily, "and what do you want?" "I am an Osbaldistone like yourself," replied the stranger suavely. "We are the last of the ancient house that bears upon its chevron the spear and spurs, mullets. So when I heard of your good fortune, I thought it but polite to call and congratulate you on your succession." Percy Osbaldistone looked across upon his unwelcome visitor with narrowed eyes. The room was dark in its old oak paneling. There was but the one lamp on the table behind him, and it was by the light of the fire that he had to scrutinize the newcomer. So far as he could see, the fellow was not unlike himself. He seemed to have the high-ridged nose of the family, which had become almost a birthmark in course of years, yet the sardonic hardness of chin and jaw was very different to his own flabbiness, and as he watched his opposite, Osbaldistone felt hatred surge up within his soul. He had heard of men having their double. Perhaps this was his own. He shivered at the thought. Then he recollected that a branch of the family had long years ago migrated to Virginia. Possibly the fellow was one of their descendants. "Are you from America?" he inquired. Then he went on in haste, not waiting for reply. "For myself, I've only just arrived here. The only servants are an ancient housekeeper and her little niece, and I can't do with visitors. You'll understand me. Take a whiskey and soda and then go." And the speaker ended with a snarl and suggestive stretch of leg and boot. "You are not very hospitable," replied his opposite, suavely as before. "But it matters little, nor do I require a whiskey and soda. I simply called in for a crack, as you say up here, and to congratulate you on succeeding." "A crack?" echoed his host surlily. "What about?" "Oh, about our family and yourself," returned the other caressingly. "I am something of a genealogist, love family histories, and dote on skeletons in the cupboard. As a matter of fact, ours is a singularly dull chronicle, except that the head of the family was an unsuccessful rebel in the '15. We never traveled beyond our Anglo-Saxon fatherdom. Deep drinking, gambling, hard riding, and the droit de seigneur." Here the speaker paused a moment. "This little niece, for example," he hinted delicately. "How the devil has this fellow guessed that?" thought Osbaldistone, white with anger and touched by secret fear. "Get out!" he cried hoarsely, and felt if his revolver lay handy in his pocket, ready for use if needful. His guest, however, took no notice of the command. Indeed, he went on more coolly than before. "I mention it," said he, "because there was an ugly story about in British East Africa, when you were farming out in the wilds beyond Simba, of the rape of a native girl who was eventually turned out of doors at night and never reached her home again. Hyena or lion? Which do you think?" Osbaldistone's hand dropped feebly back from his revolver. His face was ashen-colored. Good God! Who was this visitor? The episode of this black girl was the one thing he had never been able to forget. Shrinking back into his chair, he gazed as a rabbit may gaze upon the approaching python. Damn the fellow! He plucked forth his revolver with quivering fingers, leveled it at his guest, and pulled upon the trigger. The bullet sang across the room, passed through armchair and screen into the wainscot beyond. The smoke cleared. Osbaldistone could still see the unmoved and mocking eye of his enemy that filled him with a nameless horror. He lifted his pistol to take a better aim, then, on a strange misgiving, turned the barrel round upon himself. "You fool!" muttered the strange visitor sardonically, and as he spake he vanished as silently as he had come.
The Dream Chair by Leroy Ernest Fess. Free. By 11:15 o'clock tonight, I shall be free. Free! God, I wonder how many people in the world can appreciate and sense the full significance of that one wonderful word. Not many, I assure you. In order to have the feeling of reality being free, one has to be liberated from something. It follows, the more terrible and enslaving the something is, the greater will be the feeling of freedom when one has shaken it off completely. Tonight, when the clock on the town hall chimes the quarter hour after 11, I doubt if I shall be able to contain myself. I shall feel like a little boy on the last day of school in June. Only with the greatest difficulty shall I be able to restrain myself from dashing off into the city streets, sans coat and hat, and shouting to the multitudes as they pass. Look at me! I am even one of you now. Thank God, I am free, free, free. I said by 11:15 p.m. Easily, it should be all over by that time. In fact, it should be earlier than that. Yet there comes a gnawing fear. What if something should slip up at the last moment? What if the governor should grant an 11th hour reprieve? God, that's unthinkable. That I could not stand. My poor brain has been too near the breaking point within the last few months to endure a single night more of this unnameable hell. I tell you, I couldn't stand it. It would drive me to the madhouse. It is now 11 minutes after 10, just 1 hour more. In this brief time that remains, let me collect my scattered thoughts and put down on this paper, in as orderly a fashion as possible, the events of the last few months. I have one reason only for doing this. If anything should happen that Robert Naylor does not die in the electric chair at Hardway Prison a few moments after 11 p.m. tonight, and I, in consequence of the state's failure to execute its sentence, am rendered a madman, I want the world to know the strange and unbelievable story of Hubert Simmons. Ha! You will say that it is strange at least that my freedom and happiness should depend upon the death in the electric chair of another man. And you will say my story is unbelievable, too, when I admit to you that I have never seen or met the condemned man. Never knew of his existence until I read the account of his brutal and hideous crime in the newspaper. Surely tonight in his death cell at Hardaway Prison, he cannot dream of my unhappy existence. Unless... But to begin at the beginning. Now please understand that I am not given to either day or night dreaming. Until the night of September 26th last, I was an ordinary man, content to earn a modest living for my dear wife and our darling little ones, with no criminal thoughts in the secret depths of my heart. Just to clinch the point that my weird experience was not the result of an overwrought mind and a nervous temperament, let me say that I was not given to following the developments of the latest crime scandals that appeared daily in our newspapers. No, what happened to me came out of an entirely clear sky. I had retired early that fatal night of September 26th. When I closed my eyes in the first sweet sleep of night, I was a happy, normal man. So normal, in fact, that I did not realize my happiness or my freedom. When I awoke in the middle of the night, it was to sleep no more. Large beads of cold sweat stood on my feverish brow. My hands were shaking. My lips were parched and dry. I had experienced a hideous nightmare. In my mind, I had murdered an innocent little child. The scene had dawned upon my dreaming consciousness with a sudden fury. I found myself in a forest clearing, with the wind whistling plaintively through the giant trees, causing their gnarled limbs to sway like battered demons. A pale, cold moon shone down. Suddenly, I became aware that I was not alone. I was leading by the hand a little boy of 8 or 9, who sobbed continually. Mister, please take me back home." His words maddened me. I seized him by the throat with my 2 bare hands. I felt my fingers sink into the soft, yielding flesh. With fiendish glee, I pressed harder and harder until I saw the little fellow's eyes bulge from their sockets, his tongue protrude from his lips and become swollen, and his complexion change from pale white to livid purple. Then the stark horror of my brutal deed overcame me. I hurled the dead body from me. As I did so, one of my thumbs that had been encircling the boy's neck caught in a chain that he was wearing and tore off a small signet locket. It fell with a dull clang on the hard, frozen ground. In the moonlight, I could see the initials plainly. They were S.J. I was repeating those letters when I awoke in my own bed, my wife lying beside me and breathing evenly, and our little ones asleep in their cradles in an adjoining room. All that day at the office, the horror of that awful nightmare haunted me. It had been too vivid, too real, too horrible for an ordinary lobster or Welsh rabbit nightmare that one shakes off with the coming of dawn. Somehow, I dreaded the coming out of the afternoon papers. My worst fears were confirmed when I saw the newsboys rushing out with the latest edition and shouting as they ran, "Wextra! Wextra! All about the latest murder!" With feverish haste, I ran to the nearest corner and bought a copy. There it was, under the scare headlines, the story of my nightmare. Every detail as to the finding of the poor little body where I had hurled it, even the telltale locket with the initials S.J., which was discovered near the scene of the crime. The time given by the medical examiner as the approximate hour of the child's death also checked up with the time of my dream. Upon arriving home that night, I decided to make no mention to my wife of the strange coincidence, for that was all it was, nothing more, I argued. The scene of the murder had been more than 2,000 miles from the city where I lived. I could not possibly have committed it between the time when I went to sleep and when I awoke, even if I had employed the fastest airplane known to science. That night I had another dream. Again I was the murderer. I was fleeing, and I sensed the fear of the hunted animal. The minions of the law were at my very heels. Every night for weeks following, I played the role of the murderer at large, and every night I tramped through the streets of unknown cities. Finally, my nocturnal travels took me to familiar places. One big city particularly I was able to recognize and name from landmarks I had noticed when there in person on a visit months before. From that time on I began to look forward, with, shall I say, pleasure, to my nightly nightmares. One super thought dominated my waking life. I wanted this murderer apprehended and put to death, for then I knew I would be free. If only I could assist the police in locating the criminal. This was by no means easy, though, for in my dreams I became the hunted criminal only for split seconds during that one's nightlife. Sometimes I caught him sleeping and was forced to dream his troubled and haunting dreams. Dreams within a dream. Then one night early in October my opportunity came. I became the murderer as he was walking out the side door of a squalid lodging house of Buffalo's tenement section. Perhaps, in eluding the police dragnet laid for him in all the cities of the county, he had just changed his former place of abode and taken new quarters. At least he, or should I say I, turned full around upon reaching the street and scrutinized the number of the building as if wishing to remember it. I remembered my lips repeating 3215 Swain Street. That was the clue I had been waiting for. Early the next morning I disguised myself, took a streetcar to a remote section of the city, and then summoned by telephone a telegraph messenger boy. I hastily scribbled a telegram and handed it to the lad with a liberal tip. The message was addressed to the chief of detectives at Buffalo. It informed him that the brutal murderer of 8-year-old Sammy Jocelyn was hiding at 3215 Swain Street in his city. My message was not signed. In the following day's paper I read the details of Naylor's capture in Buffalo. The Swain Street rooming house had been surrounded by police, acting on an anonymous tip that came by wire from a distant city. Naylor had been surprised while shaving in the bathroom and taken into custody without a struggle. That night, for a few agonized moments of the nightmare, I paced the narrow confines of a prison cell. It would be repetition here to narrate what followed. That, I trust, is familiar to everyone. Naylor's sensational confession and his subsequent trial and conviction. I might add, though, that nightly for the past month my soul, for brief fractions of a moment, has been confined in the death house at Hardaway and destined in Naylor's body to pace up and down the caged room, and in the very shadow of the electric chair. God, but don't I know the feelings of the condemned man? That awful monotony of waiting for the day? The mock courtesy of the guards who watch you, awake and asleep, as a cat watches a canary, lest you take your own life and rob the state of its just dues. The dismal efforts at bravado and cheeriness of the other condemned prisoners who keep kidding each other with, "It won't be long now." That death-like stillness that falls over the prison like a pall whenever one of the condemned takes that last walk out through the little green door at the side. The dull thump that the other prisoners in the death house hear, and the flickering of the electric light in the corridor they see when the lethal current is turned on. Yes, I know. I have been there. Last night I was Naylor pacing his cell. 6 steps up, then turn, and 6 steps back. Then do it all over again. 6 up, 6 back, 6 up, 6 back. Every once in a while I would pause to look down the corridor at the little green door at the end. "It won't be long now," I said to a praying Negro who occupied the cell next to mine on the right, and I tried to laugh. Laugh? It was a sorry attempt. When I awoke in my bed, I was laughing like an insane man. My hands were covering my face, hiding the vision of the little green door at the end of the hall. I have just looked at my watch. It is now 2 minutes after 11, and I must hurry. Naylor is enjoying his last few minutes on earth. Did I say enjoying? Ha, ha! In a few more minutes, they'll be cutting Naylor to pieces on an autopsy table, and I shall be a free man. Dead men tell no tales. Neither do dead men do anything to dream about. Just a big blackness without dreams. That's what death is. With Naylor dead, I shan't dream any more of his hideous nightmares. It is now 5 minutes after 11. It surely won't be long now. They're probably dressing him in the black suit, the one, you know, with the slit in the right pants leg below the knee. And I bet 2 cents and a cookie that funny little priest with his graveyard face and black prayer book is in the cell too. jabbering off some ritual, words that Naylor doesn't hear. 7 minutes after 11. I am feeling drowsy. But there isn't much more to tell, or much longer to wait. By now, like as not, the two prison guards, dressed in their blackest and best, are knocking on Naylor's door. "Come right in, gentlemen. Take a chair. Ha ha!" They're leading Naylor through his cell door. The wedding procession is on. There they go. Tramp, 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 down the long corridor to the little green door at the end. Here comes the bride. Da-dum, da-da. Why doesn't someone play the wedding march from Lohengrin? I want to know. The chair. The chair. That's what Naylor sees when that little green door opens. Kind of makes you shake a little bit in the knees, Naylor? Now maybe you'll haunt my dreams again and make me a murderer by night, eh? Gad, but I'm getting sleepy. I can hardly hold my eyes open. But it won't be long now, as the boys in the death cells say. They're strapping him in the chair. That cold steel electrode around the right leg calf doesn't feel so good, boy? And that black cap that shuts off the light of this world? All done in a few seconds, Naylor? These execution boys sure do know their ropes. Not a moment wasted. Every one at his job, and every job done neatly and with dispatch. How'd you like to get up and give your seat to a lady, Naylor? Ha, ha, ha! You can't blame me for having my little joke, for in a minute or two now, I shall be free. 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 I only hope I can stay awake for a minute or two. Then it'll all be over. That funny little priest is standing before the chair. Gad, can I ever stay awake? The executioner's hand is on the death switch, and he is waiting, waiting. The funny little priest begins to pray. Our Father, who art in... Here the manuscript ends abruptly in the middle of the sentence. All the newspapers the following day carried under the front page streamers the detailed story of how the arch-fiend and murderer, Robert Nixon, met his death in the electric chair at Hardaway Prison at 11:13 the night before. It is doubted if any of the morbidly curious who devoured the account of the execution in the Evening Star noticed the following little item down at the bottom of an inside page. Hubert Simmons, 42 years old, of 47 Glendale Avenue, this city, was found dead in the library of his home shortly before midnight last night, when his wife, Sarah Simmons, returned from a visit to some neighbors. Medical examiner Lancer, who investigated the case, declared that death apparently had been caused by heart failure, though he admitted being puzzled over the appearance of slight scorches on the flesh on the crown of the dead man's head and on his right leg below the knee. He will perform an autopsy on the body before issuing a death certificate. A watch in Simmons' pocket was broken when his body crumbled from the chair on which he had been sitting before his library table and fell to the floor. The hand showed the mechanism had stopped at 11:13 o'clock, which probably marks the time of Simmons' demise. Several pages of a manuscript Simmons had been writing, apparently up to the moment of his death, were taken by the medical examiner, in case the autopsy on Simmons' body indicates he met his death by other than natural causes. Dr. Lancer said he would attempt to decipher the notes to see if they would throw any light on the case. Simmons had been in ill health for the last 3 months, according to his wife. He did not rest well at night, and often had fits of nervousness that kept him awake for hours, all of which would indicate he died of natural causes, according to Dr. Lancer. Besides his wife Sarah, the deceased leaves 2 small children, Alice 8 and John 7. Funeral services will be held at the home Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock.
By the Shrine of St. Cuthbert by Howard Pease. The bells were ringing to evensong in the great cathedral dedicated to St. Cuthbert that stands like a fortress on its rock above the murmuring weir. Half house of God, half castle gainst the Scot, in the windy dusk of a November evening. The people of the saint, however, the Halyware folk, the folk of the holy man, were few in attendance that afternoon, and the great nave seemed very empty as I sat down in a seat in front of the gallery beside the north door of entry. I looked about me and admired the mighty Norman pillars, diapered and fluted with exceeding skill by the great master builders of old, who built to, even as their great duke swore by, the splendour of God. My eye wandered upward and rested upon the great chevrons resembling sword cuts that seemed deep hacked within the rounded arches of the triforium. Thence onward my gaze fluttered like a butterfly and rested upon a leering corbel which seemed to scoff at priest and priestcraft with protruding tongue. The mighty stone roof soaring aloft, a ship's keel upturned, drew my eye eastward to the choir. There on the great east window, rose-shaped and many-coloured, the invading dusk gathered like water drops upon the panes, and wove its dun mantle over them. The anthem now pealed along the roof, lapping capitals, corbels, and pillars in a tide of sound that swept unresisted through the wide spaces of the cathedral. As the echoing song grew fainter and ebbed away into the twilight shadows, my gaze returned to my immediate surroundings and rested unconcernedly upon a man sitting a seat or two in front of me, beside one of the massive piers. He seemed to be in a most distressed and nervous condition, for he peered about him with an evident alarm, which was pitiful to witness. As he turned his face about, I saw it was haggard with fear and sorrow, or remorse. His hair was matted, and beads of sweat were thick upon his brow. It was as if he were terrified of impending danger. Yet what could he be afraid of in the great calm of the solemn cathedral? The benediction had been given, and the sparse congregation had now risen and was slowly departing. Yet he rose not, but seemed to be hiding from view as he crouched behind the form in front of him, and edged his way slowly within the shadow of the heavy pier to his left hand. I sat on, listening to the voluntary, and it held me by its strangeness. I knew that the dean and chapter's organist was away on holiday, and I wondered who the strange player might be who was setting forth his own soul in the notes of the pealing organ. He sang of fellowship, of comradeship in ancient days, through stress of adventure and deadly combat. Then, with organ sobs that shook the heart, of death, and the infinite loneliness of death, and of the inappeasable sorrow of the survivor lamenting his Jonathan. A pause of black silence. Then, brokenly, a little soul of life began to re-arise, a growth of hope, the fierce determination of revenge, quickening with flame, breaking into triumph. And now, as the lights were being turned out, and gloom came rushing in upon the empty spaces of the cathedral, I saw the unhappy figure shift indecisively as he rose from his seat in front of me, glance hurriedly about as if for a way of escape, then moving unsteadily round the pier. To my surprise he shuffled off in the direction of the organ. The music seemed to fascinate him, to paralyse his will, even as the sphex paralyses its victim with its sting. The organist was now engaged upon the coda of his fugue. The former motifs were rehearsed: love, sorrow, and revenge. Triumph resounded from the loft when I heard above the quickening notes a sudden patter of heels across the nave, then a pitiful drumming of fists upon the barred door that led into the east corner of the cloisters. Knowing that escape that way was now impossible for the distracted man, and feeling pity for him, I crossed the nave and followed after him in the gloom. As I drew near, I heard him flee again, down the south aisle to the other door of the cloisters. Here once more he shook unavailingly upon the latch, and drummed pitifully with his fists. There was a scrabbling with nails on the oaken door. Then a cry of anguish smote on my ear. An awful terror evidently had him in grip. He rushed wildly on again, on to the only remaining door of escape into the northern close. Suddenly the music stopped on a throb of joy. The shock caused me to halt. As I started again to walk towards the door, I heard no longer the miserable patter of feet in front of me. I was just about to reach out a hand to feel for the latch in the darkness, when I stumbled over an obstacle on the pavement. I knelt down and felt about with my hands. I found a man's body lying inert at my feet. God in heaven! The darkness seemed to buffet me upon the ears. I heard a vague cry escape my lips, for the fugitive's hand had dropped from mine with a thud upon the stone. The man was dead.